It's hard to ever frame despair as beautiful outside of some cold academic conceit. In fact, that not only seems crass and inelegant, it seems fundamentally wrong. However, when despair is confined to a moment in a piece of art, particularly one centered around a decidedly universal sense of loss, perhaps one can be afforded some allowance in defining a poem, song, or story as both desperate and beautiful. I'm curious what you, the listener, think about such a vexing notion. Despair is inherent to the poetry of Anne Sexton, a watermark of sorts that governed her arc and approach to writing poetry. That dark impulse compelled her success as much as it may have confined her to an untimely death. According to Katha Pollitt of the New York Times, within 10 years of Anne Sexton's first published work of poetry in 1960, she became, quote, one of the most honored poets in America, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the first female member of the Harvard chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, and the subject of a television documentary, unquote. Despair became a kind of currency for Sexton's work as she grew in popularity. In a sadly prescient poem entitled Wanting to Die, she wrote, "Death's a sad bone, bruised, you'd say, and yet she waits for me, year after year, to so delicately undo an old wound, to empty my breath from its bad prison." Perhaps her most precise and universal poem on despair is the one she wrote after the death of her parents, entitled The Truth the Dead Know. Its subtle and swift meter allows it to unravel like some hopeless lullaby. It reads as follows. Gone, I say, and walk from church, refusing the stiff procession to the grave, letting the dead ride alone in the hearse. It is June. I'm tired of being brave. We drive to the Cape. I cultivate myself where the sun gutters from the sky, where the sea swings in like an iron gate, and we touch. In another country, people die. My darling, the wind falls in like stones from the white-hearted water, and when we touch, we enter touch entirely. No one's alone. Men kill for this, or for as much. And what of the dead? They lie without shoes in their stone boats. They are more like stone than the sea would be if it stopped. They refuse to be blessed, throat, eye, and knucklebone. The second to last stanza in particular resonates like an empty and ancient well. The self-referential use of my darling is both intimate and strange. Still, it's as though she's not only addressing herself, but the reader as well. A desperate longing centered around the universal need for human contact pulls the reader into her deep and treacherous waters. Her words become a siren song whispered right beside the reader as hope capsizes into the ink of those brief lines. One is reminded of the finality in gently stroking the face of a loved one who has departed to other worlds, or the persistent memory of some lost lover's face in the early AM hours before any light can arrive to save us. Sadly, the seeming sanctity that informed much of Sexton's more profound work slowly gave way to a pernicious need for adulation. Katha Pollitt continues, quote, Unfortunately, Sexton's particularly American success led to a particularly American downfall. An urgent need for ever more attention and esteem, and an inability to reckon the cost. By the end of the 1960s, alcohol and pills were impairing her creativity, and the quest for fame had become an end in itself. Increasingly, she craved a kind of celebrity that can hardly ever be achieved in our time by words alone, unquote. Such assessments are not an indictment on Sexton, but rather on the nature of despair itself. It's more of an explanation of the precarious role in our lives, especially when it becomes our ineluctable guide. It draws us into its spectacular incandescent darkness and then seeks to drown us as we revel in our own pathos and defeat. So can despair ultimately be beautiful? Honestly, I'm still not sure. Too often we crown the suffering involved in artistry and arrogantly look past the terrible toll it inflicts in the form of pain, narcissism, and at times, wholesale destruction of the self and those who exist along the periphery of such sad souls. What I can say, however, is that Anne Sexton gives perfect shape to the grief and despair surrounding her parents' passing in The Truth the Dead Know. That shape, though, is so accurate and precise that it punctures one's soul less as a wound or an infection, and infinitely more as an opening and resolution toward the heartbreak and grandeur that defines our fleeting existence here on this earth.